United States, less than half of the students ever end up pursuing a job in a tenure track slot in a major research university. In fact, it's probably in the 20% range. And yet, we're not very good at helping students understand what those real pathways are that they will follow. Third challenge area I'm simply calling standards and values of the graduates. In the United States and around the world, we are now challenged to ensure that all of our doctoral students who will engage in research and professional leadership in research fields are well grounded in the ethical underpinning of their work. And we've had only too many incidents in the US in the last several years suggesting that there's work to be done in this domain. So these are issues, challenges that come to us that have to do with really policies and practices that we actually control in the university. And then we get on to things that impact us and create challenges, but that we don't really control. And one of them is who comes to graduate school. So in the US situation, domestically, America is riding a kind of demographic wave. And the principal characteristic of that wave is that American undergraduate students who could potentially come to graduate school anywhere in the United States are increasingly coming from underrepresented populations, African Americans, Latinos, in some Asian students. And these students, if you take the Asian subgroup out and look only at other underrepresented minorities, these students go to graduate school at half the rate of majority students. So that if we don't, there's a real possibility in the US that there just won't be anybody coming to graduate school in sufficient numbers to run the kinds of graduate programs at the size level that we've had in the past. International students continue to rise in terms of applicants over the long run, but ultimately this will plateau. And it will plateau because the University of Hong Kong, the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology, Tsinghua, Beijing, the University of the network of universities in Singapore, the parts of the world from which large numbers of students have historically come to the United States are now developing a really robust, very high quality infrastructure for graduate education that will ultimately, and even now, provide real competition to the United States. The real challenge for us in the US, and this is a really interesting slide that I'm going to show you now because it really shocks our political leaders when I show them, is that while it is true that if you look in science and technology and engineering fields, we have had over the last 30 years a gradual increase in degree production, ever creeping up to meet the needs. US citizens and permanent residents as a proportion of that total has declined and declined dramatically over that same 30-year period. So we've gone from a time when something in the neighborhood of 81% of all science and engineering degrees, doctoral degrees were awarded to US students, to today, where that number hovers around 59%, but if you take out the permanent residents, it falls to below 50%. So that's a very serious challenge because it means that as all the things that we want to see happen, that is wonderful graduate doctoral programs in science and engineering in every field develop around the world, the potential pool of wonderful students coming to US graduate schools shrinks. Big challenge for us. The third circle I'd like to talk about is basically the social and public policy environment. I know you have someone here from the Research Council, Funding Council. These people are very important. These are very important people. Be nice to these people. Tell these people a lot about the good work you're doing, because the future hinges fundamentally in Hong Kong and in the United States on our capacity to explain to our bankers the social and political value of the work that we do. We think this is so important at the Council of Graduate Schools that we have made a significant investment in developing a report that lays out that case for political leadership and for the community as a whole in the U.S. And I want to tell you something funny. This is a little hard to believe, but our colleagues in mainland China thought this book was of such great value that they asked us if we could translate it for them into Chinese. And believe it or not, we happen to have somebody who could do that. And so you can read a Chinese version of The Path Forward, which is now also on our website. Now, as you may know, we have somewhat different political systems in the United States and China. However, what this message said to me was, even though the political systems are very different, the reality of needing to place doctoral education and research in a political context so that the public good, the public value of our enterprise is understood is really critical, whatever kind of political system you're living in. And finally, let me speak to our global challenge. And the global challenge from this slide doesn't really look like it's very serious. You all know that we had this precipitous drop in international applications after 9/11. And it continued really until 2006, when we began to see a return. And every year since then, including this most recently released data, 2010-2011, showed that applications from around the world to U.S. graduate schools are up. But the interesting reality is, they're up very, very differentially. The main driver of this, the main driver of our increase in 2011 is China. Chinese applications were up 22%. And this is the 5th year of double-digit applications from China. Now, what's going on in China, as you know, is that they're graduating a lot of bachelor's degrees. They're graduating more bachelor's degrees right now than they can actually employ or than they can find spots for in graduate school. We are the short-term beneficiary of this incredible explosion. I mean, China has a lot of people in China. Any country that has that many people is going to have a whole lot of talented people. I mean, the top 1% of a place with that kind of population has got a lot of people to go to graduate school. And so we're the beneficiaries. But because it is so differential, it's clear that America's future, that is relying on simply increasing international enrollment as a solution, is not a good strategy. But it is the message here that I say to all of the students in the audience: there are still huge opportunities for graduate education in the United States, and international students continue to play a hugely important role. So this is the framework of challenges that we face, and the challenges really boil down to how are we going to deal with two issues. And these two themes are right now dominating discussion in the U.S. about higher education generally and graduate education specifically. The first is the issue of accountability. What are the actual outcomes that we're trying to produce by a PhD program? Does it, for example, make sense to continue to keep a mindset of preparing every doctoral student you have for a slot in Berkeley when that slot is not going to exist for 99.9% of the students? What is it that we're actually trying to do in doctoral programs? What are the real career outcomes? Do we know what they are? How can we learn what they are? What are the social impacts of the relative emphasis in different fields? What does it mean that we now are producing large numbers of humanities PhDs who simply have no hope of finding jobs in their field? And finally, these issues around efficiency and effectiveness that I talked about earlier. How long should the PhD be? What should be the reasonable expectation on completion rates? Is there good attrition? Surely we don't want everybody to graduate. But what is the nature of good attrition? You know, I've got to stop here to tell a joke. I shouldn't, Paul, take the time to tell a joke, but this is worth telling because it really applies to this issue of completion, which I increasingly find out is an issue around the world. So many years ago, we had this governor in Georgia, the state of Georgia. And now this is Georgia, the United States, not the other Georgia. And his name was Lester Maddox. So Lester Maddox was always in trouble with the federal government because of the deplorable state of the prisons in Georgia. And so he was always hauled before the courts, the federal courts, and what are you doing? You know, these prisons are deplorable. These people are living in substandard conditions. This is inhumane. And poor old Lester Maddox got tired of this haranguing. And so he just said in court one day, well, I'll just tell you one thing, Judge. I'll tell you, if you give me better prisoners, I'll give you better prisons. So this is sort of the faculty view of the students. You know, if you give me better doctoral students, I'll give you better completion rates. Turns out that's not true. We actually have data which show that there's no relationship between the quality of the input in any particular program and the likelihood of students graduating. So it actually has to do with a whole bunch of other things that we should be able to control. So the second big issue that emerges from this melange of stuff I've been talking about is quality. Now, quality in the U.S. has always been our hallmark. What we have always said is the reason we've been able to attract students from around the world is because of the quality of our program. And quality as measured by research capacity and research impact of faculty remains very high. But today, in the light of increased demands for accountability, quality is, in definition, becoming a bit broader. So when we talk about quality now, we mean things like innovation in the curriculum, serious attention to interdisciplinarity, serious attention to working and introducing students to work at the interface of disciplines. We're talking about ethical practice, addressing ethical practice in the course of study. We're talking about the development of professional skills, transferable skills that will help the graduate be successful, whatever domain of work they end up pursuing. And we're talking about doing all of this while simultaneously doing two things that we've always been good at in the U.S., which is preserving the core development of expertise in the discipline. I mean, this thing about interdisciplinarity is very important, but PhD graduates have to know something about something. And they have to know it in a way that is fundamental enough that they can engage in independent discovery. And to do all of these things while maintaining depth in the core and while maintaining a capacity to customize. Because in the U.S. context, as here, every PhD is an individual, custom experience. So there are huge challenges that come and are summarized by both of these themes. And so the question is, with all of this going on, what should universities do? Now, I'm a political scientist and I study public policy. And one of the kind of theoretical frameworks, let me call it, that I've liked to work with in my own disciplinary work is called the garbage can theory of politics. Now, the garbage can theory of politics assumes, in an effort to describe public policy, how it's made, is that in a political system, you kind of imagine a garbage can, and inside all kinds of things are swirling around, bumping into each other, separating. You've got policy perspectives, you've got political values, you've got specific solutions, and occasionally, if things are just right, the solutions and the politics and the implementation strategies line up, and you actually get change moving in the right direction. Now, at the risk of advising graduate schools in the United States and Hong Kong, using a rather bad metaphor, let me try now to kind of talk a little bit about how this all fits together. And what I'd like to wrap up with is the notion that it's not a question of how each individual process works. We can fix individual things. But it's really a question of how all of these processes, how all of these influences, how all of these issues work together. So we've really got to figure out how universities can organize their garbage cans. So this is my proposal for organizing the garbage can. So you've got inputs, you've got processes, and you've got outputs. The inputs we have to attend to, and I would argue universities need to be taking intentional actions in each one of these areas. With regard to inputs, advocacy must be in place. We need to continue to find ways to explain to our stakeholders the value of what we do. Fundraising is absolutely critical. I mean, I talked to someone earlier today from the University of Hong Kong. I said, what's your big issue? Money. Well, I mean, everybody's big issue is money. And we must find ways of through private donations and public investment of ensuring that quality work is supported. Again, an input. And finally, access. For the United States, the issue is really diversity of historically underrepresented populations and ensuring the barriers remain low for international students coming in. For Hong Kong, it's a different kind of diversity. It's finding ways to increase the inclusion of students from around the world, not just mainland China, which is a wonderful source of students for you as it is for us, but students from around the world to create in this really wonderful university a more diverse culture. But there are also process issues, and the process issues I've alluded to before. Quality, but quality in this not just the historic sense of research impact of the faculty, but in a deeper sense of innovation. Ethics, critical. Interdisciplinarity, finding ways to ensure that in our doctoral degree programs, we engage as deeply in interdisciplinary thinking as we do in our research. We've got it down in research. It's much more of a challenge in our programs. And finally, globalization. This is an area where we in the United States have a huge amount to learn from the University of Hong Kong, because you, whether you know it or not, are global leaders in joint degrees, are global leaders in working collaboratively with institutions around the world. This partnership that you have with Imperial College London is really just remarkably strong. And I myself, when I want to point to an institution that's doing it right, point to the University of Hong Kong. And finally, there are the outputs. And with respect to outputs, I'd like to posit there are three areas in the United States and perhaps elsewhere that need attention. Learning outcomes. Very controversial to talk about learning outcomes with American faculties. They say the outcome is the PhD. What do you mean to ask me to be more specific than that? And if I thought we could get away with it, I'd be happy not to ask them to be more specific than that. But it turns out that all the regulatory agencies, including our funders, would actually like us to be more specific than that. So trying to figure out how we can articulate in a deep and meaningful and non-trivial way what the real tangible outcomes of doctoral training are is a challenge. Career tracking. The meeting that Paul and I are going to and that Hong Kong is wonderfully co-hosting is going to look into that globally. What do we know about where students are going globally and what are the mechanisms for finding that out? And finally, cost effectiveness. This is related to the fundraising on the one hand, and the one hand is input, and the other hand it's an output. We simply need to understand more about how to demonstrate the value of the inputs, the financial inputs that our bankers, whether they're private individuals, individual students, or governments, are making. Now, this is kind of a big set of challenges that we face in the United States and in many ways that you face here in Hong Kong as you begin your second century. In some ways, the menu is so profound and so overwhelming that it's easy to get discouraged and to think, well, you know, this is basically hopeless. But when I feel like that, I always go to Abraham Lincoln. Now, Abraham Lincoln, as you know, was the president who led us into and through the Civil War in America. And it turns out, even though he was not formally educated, he was a very smart guy, and he wrote a lot, and he gave a lot of speeches, and all those speeches got written down. So when I really get discouraged myself and try to think of how should I get a perspective on this, I go back and I read Abraham Lincoln's speeches. Because the thing is, Abraham Lincoln basically said something about everything. And so this is how I'd like to end. So in the dimmest days of the Civil War, when Abraham Lincoln thought there was not a shadow of a hope of getting the country back together, he gave a speech to a small group of people in New York City who were also equally discouraged. And he ended the speech with this line: "The best thing about the future is that it comes only one day at a time." Let me end there, and let's spend 15 minutes talking about the future. Thank you. Do you want me to stay up here for the... Sure.
Any questions? First of all, let me thank you for an excellent speech, very provoking and very interesting, and open the floor for questions.
Let me invite people to raise questions, not necessarily about what I talked about, but, you know, I've been in the doctoral education business for a long time, both as a person who trained doctoral students and then as a person who had a position comparable to Paul's in a university, and now this opportunity that I have to work nationally and globally. So I actually think about all aspects of doctoral education. Would be happy to talk about anything you'd like to talk about. Don't feel constrained by
name is Sunny. I am a TA at Polygon. I want to ask, many students have to take GRE in order to study a PhD program.
Yes.
And we have to recite like over 5,000 glossaries in order to be equipped for the English test. Do you think it as a barrier for us to study a PhD degree, or does its necessity itself is justified? Thank you.
Right. I think that's a really good question. The GRE was developed in the United States in the period after World War II in an effort. See, what happened before World War II is only a few people went to graduate school anywhere. And they all went to, one of 10 or maybe 20 max universities. And everybody knew everybody. So there was no need for the GRE because you just looked at where they went to undergraduate and you called their professor and they either were or were not qualified, and that was it. But in an effort to try to level the playing field and give people information, give admissions committees in universities information about students who had gone to schools that they never heard of and didn't really know anything about, in order to make it fair, the GRE was developed. So it was really developed initially to increase access. As graduate enrollment became more international in the United States, it continued to play that same role, because you have to understand, just a school like Berkeley probably gets 35 or 40,000 applications from international students a year. The capacity to sift through those applications without the GRE, it just would be impossible. So what the GRE does for American universities is narrow the range of people who they have to look at seriously. And it's basically fairness from the point of view of the student, and from a managerial point of view, it's the way you can manage a very large number of applications. I wish there were another way, but what graduate schools in the United States are trying to do is pick the best match for their program. And they want a blend of domestic students and international students, of students from China and students from Germany, of men and women, of students who've had different kinds of backgrounds. And the GRE is part of how they are able to make those decisions. But I appreciate the problem, especially appreciate that the travel required to take the GRE for many students in many countries is just extraordinary. And it's, my belief is, we study completion rates and we study time to degree and so on. I will tell you, international students are better on all of these indicators, all of them, than U.S. students. And the reason they are is that the kids who get to the United States have gone through all of this stuff. And so they are just much better organized and much more directed than the average American student.
Debra, thanks. This Sunday is an important day for us. I have two questions. One is, how do you advocate the cause for postgraduate or graduate education when you have the success stories like the founders of Microsoft,